How did you make your mother understand she picked the wrong daughter? My name is Emma, and when I was 28 my life took a turn I never expected. My mother Susan decided to adopt a 16-year-old girl named Lily. She called it a miracle blessing sent straight from heaven, and said it gave her a reason to smile again after my father passed away. I truly believed her intentions were good. She had been lonely for years, and Lily was about to age out of foster care. So I supported the idea fully, and even helped pay for the adoption. $5,000 came straight out of my savings without hesitation. At first everything felt right. Susan sounded happier than she had in years, and Lily acted polite, grateful, and eager to please. She helped around the house and thanked me constantly. It felt like we were building something positive together, and I thought maybe this was the fresh start my mother needed. That calm only lasted about a month before the tone of Susan's calls began to change. She started calling with requests instead of updates. Lily needs school clothes, can you take her shopping? I said yes without thinking because it felt reasonable. That shopping trip turned into $800 of designer clothes. Lily chose the most expensive items without hesitation, and Susan said she deserved it because she had suffered so much in life. The following week Susan called again, saying Lily needed a laptop for school. $2,000 later, she also needed a phone. The newest model, another $1,000 gone. Each time Susan cried on the phone, saying this poor child had never had anything nice, and reminding me that I had everything growing up. She said I could afford it and that Lily was my sister now. When I tried to say she was not my sister, Susan accused me of being cold and heartless, and said family helps family buy. The third month I realized I had become Lily's personal bank account. Dance classes were $800 a month. Private tutoring was $600, plus endless spending money, clothes, shoes, and random expenses. Susan never asked if I could afford it, she simply assumed I would pay. While all of this was happening, she forgot my birthday for the first time in my entire life. She was too busy taking Lily on a spa weekend because Lily needed to relax after her traumatic past. A spa weekend I paid for. I tried to set boundaries and told Susan I could not keep funding everything. She snapped back saying her pension barely covered expenses and that I made good money. She said Lily deserved the same opportunities I had. I reminded her that I worked through college and had a job at 16 because she made me. Susan dismissed it, saying that was different and that Lily needed nurturing. Christmas was the breaking point I did not see coming. Susan invited me over, and when I arrived the tree was surrounded by gifts. Every single one was for Lily. There was nothing for me, not even a card. Susan said she did not want Lily to feel bad by seeing me open gifts too, and that the day was about making Lily feel special. I left without arguing, and later Susan called me selfish for ruining Lily's first real Christmas. In January, Susan called in a panic saying Lily had been accepted to a private college that cost $50,000 a year. She asked if I would help with tuition. I told her I was saving for a house and still had student loans. Susan said Lily's education mattered more than my comfort and called me greedy. When I finally said no, she stopped speaking to me for 2 weeks. Then called crying saying Lily was devastated and thought I hated her. Susan said I was destroying her future. I gave in and agreed to pay for 1 semester just to see how she did. Lily failed every class that semester and spent her time partying. $25,000 gone. Susan made excuses, saying Lily was adjusting and needed more support, and demanded I pay for another semester. When I refused, Susan turned cruel and reminded me of everything she sacrificed raising me. She said I owed her and Lily. I told her Lily had already received more support than I ever did. That is when Susan threatened to change her will and leave everything to Lily because Lily needed it more. I laughed and reminded her she had nothing to leave but debt and a car. She hung up on me. 2 days later Lily called asking to meet for coffee. She ordered the most expensive drink and put it on my tab, then casually asked if I could buy Susan's house so they could live there rent-free. I stood up and walked out. Susan later called accusing me of being abusive and said Lily now needed therapy because of me. That was the moment I realized nothing about this situation was normal. I reached out to my Aunt Carol and my Uncle Mark and told them everything. They were furious and admitted they had been sending Susan money every month thinking she was struggling. When we compared notes, we realized Susan had been collecting thousands from all of us, while still taking my money for Lily. We all stopped payments immediately. Susan panicked and called everyone saying her bills were overdue and Lily needed things. When we suggested she or Lily get a job, she was offended. A few days later, Susan called crying because Lily had left. That night I checked my bank accounts and saw the damage clearly. Over $40,000 gone in just 3 months. My accounts were drained and my credit cards nearly maxed out. Instead of relief, I felt hollow and foolish. The next morning, I ignored Susan's voicemails and tried to understand how I let this happen. That was when Aunt Carol called and told me she had hired a private investigator named Megan Porter to look into Lily's past. What she found would change everything, and I was not ready for what came next. Carol stayed on the line while I tried to process what she was telling me. Megan Porter had pulled sealed foster records and financial complaints tied to Lily's name. Lily had been adopted and returned by 3 different families in just a few years. Each situation ended with missing money, credit card debt, and valuables sold off quietly. One family lost nearly $20,000. Another tried to press charges, but Lily was still a minor, so everything disappeared into sealed files. The last family simply returned her to the system and walked away. My stomach twisted as Carol said either Susan ignored this history or chose not to care. Either way, this was never an accident. When the call ended, I sat alone at my kitchen table feeling sick, validated, angry, and embarrassed all at once. Suddenly, every strange moment made sense, and that clarity hurt almost as much as the loss. A few days later, Mark called and said we needed to meet without Susan. He wanted everyone who had been sending money to lay everything out. Carol came with a notebook, and Mark spread bank statements across his dining table. Another uncle named David joined us by phone and admitted he had also been helping Susan every month. When we added everything together, the number was shocking. Susan had been pulling in more than $6,000 a month from family alone on top of her pension and my payments for Lily. None of us had known about the others. We agreed to stop enabling her and decided to set boundaries, even if it meant Susan would be angry. None of us wanted to be her safety net anymore. I did not want to feel like a walking wallet ever again. 2 weeks after Lily disappeared, Susan's landlord called me directly. She had listed me as her emergency contact and her rent was over a month late. I called Susan immediately, and before I could mention the rent, she started crying about Lily stealing jewelry and cash. I cut her off and told her about the landlord. There was a long silence before she admitted the money from family had gone toward Lily and other things. She mentioned buying a new couch and leasing a newer car. I felt something inside me snap when I realized she had spent our help on comforts instead of necessities. When I asked how much debt she had, she admitted to $17,000 on credit cards. That night, Carol urged me to check my credit report. When I logged in, my hands started shaking. There were 2 credit cards opened in my name months before Lily ever arrived. Balances in the thousands and transactions I did not recognize. Cash advances, online shopping, restaurants near Susan's home. My own mother had done this. I called Carol back and could barely speak. She told me gently but firmly that this was identity theft, and that being my mother did not change that fact. The next day, I sat in a small law office across from an attorney named Daniel Ross. He listened quietly and confirmed what I feared. This was financial abuse, and I could dispute the debt, but it would trigger a criminal investigation into Susan. Hearing it out loud made me feel sick. Protecting my future meant potentially sending my mother to jail. Daniel gave me paperwork and told me to think carefully. I drove straight to Susan's house with the statements on the seat beside me. She opened the door, looking smaller than I remembered, and I walked past her without greeting. When I laid the papers out, she turned pale and started making excuses. Desperation, pension not enough, you have money. I told her I was drowning in debt because of her. She lashed out and said I should have budgeted better. That was when I told her I would file a police report unless she signed a repayment agreement. After tears, anger, and silence, she signed $50 a month for 20 years. It was not about the money anymore, it was about accountability. Not long after that, Mark called furious. Lily had contacted his teenage daughter through social media claiming she was homeless and needed help. She almost sent money before Mark intervened. We realized Lily was targeting younger family members. Now, I felt protective anger and warned everyone to block her. I then called Megan Porter again and asked her to look into Lily's current situation. A few days later, Megan called back with information that made my skin crawl. Lily was living with an older man named Brian in the next county and bragging online under a fake name about scamming her rich adoptive family. Megan sent screenshots and there it was, in black and white, Lily mocking Susan and celebrating how easy it was to manipulate people who wanted to feel like heroes. Seeing that smug satisfaction erased any lingering doubt. This had never been confusion or trauma, it was calculated. I shared everything with Carol and Mark and we quietly documented it all for our own protection. 3 nights later, Susan called me in the early morning hours, saying she was at the hospital with chest pains. Fear and suspicion fought inside me as I drove there. Part of me remembered something Megan mentioned about Lily encouraging fake emergencies. But I could not risk ignoring a real one. At the hospital, doctors eventually ruled out a heart attack and said it was a severe panic episode. I sat beside her bed for hours while machines beeped softly. When Susan fell asleep, I searched her purse for insurance papers and found a folded letter instead. It was written by Lily weeks before she left and described a plan to fake medical emergencies to make me give more money. My hands shook as I read it again and again. Susan was not a victim, she was a willing partner. When she woke, I confronted her with the letter. After denial and silence, she finally admitted she knew what Lily was doing. She said loneliness and grief made her feel needed, and she did not want to stop. Hearing that broke something final inside. May told Susan I would help her only under strict conditions and that everything would be in writing. She protested until I reminded her of the fraud. The next day, Daniel drafted an agreement requiring counseling, repayment, no contact with Lily, and verification of any emergencies. Susan signed with shaking hands. Having rules in black and white felt like reclaiming my power. Weeks later, she tested those boundaries by demanding money for car repairs and exploding when I asked for proof. I hung up and did not answer her calls for nearly 2 weeks. The silence felt peaceful. Then a message appeared from Lily filled with guilt, manipulation, and claims of pregnancy and sickness. I recognized every tactic and blocked her everywhere after sending the evidence to Daniel. Protecting myself finally felt natural. Months passed and Susan faced eviction after failing to pay rent. With Carol and Mark, I helped her downsize into a small apartment she could afford. Watching her leave the old place was painful but necessary. Later, the three of us met and created a plan to share responsibility without enabling her. Rotating check-ins, shared therapy costs, and documentation for any help. For the first time, I did not feel alone in this. Around then, I started therapy with a counselor named Laura Bennett who specialized in family trauma. Session by session, she helped me see how these patterns existed long before Lily, how guilt, obligation, and responsibility had shaped my life. Understanding that truth hurt, but it also freed me. I was not cruel or selfish for saying no. I was finally choosing myself, and that realization changed everything. By the time winter settled in, I could feel the weight of everything finally slowing down. Susan was in her smaller apartment, and no longer calling every day. The constant emergencies had faded now that there was no one feeding into them. Carol and Mark rotated, checking on her, and David helped occasionally. Knowing it was not all on me anymore, lifted a pressure I had carried for years. Therapy with Laura continued weekly, and each session peeled back another layer of guilt I had mistaken for love. She helped me see how my childhood shaped my instinct to rescue, and how easily that instinct had been exploited. Understanding that pattern did not erase the pain, but it gave me language for it, and that mattered more than I expected. Susan and I began speaking less frequently. And when we did, the conversations stayed shallow. Weather doctor visits, small complaints about the apartment. She still tested boundaries, but less aggressively. Sometimes she would sigh and mention how hard everything was, and pause, as if waiting for me to offer money. When I did not, she would change the subject. It was awkward, but also proof that the rules were working. One afternoon she asked if we could meet for lunch somewhere neutral. I agreed with hesitation and chose a small diner halfway between our places. When she arrived, she looked older and tired in a way that had nothing to do with illness. We ate quietly for a while before she admitted she resented my success and felt left behind in her own life. It was the first honest thing she had said in months, and I listened without fixing anything. After at lunch there was an unspoken shift between us. Not forgiveness, and not closeness, but realism. I told her I needed her to see me as her daughter, not her solution. She nodded without fully understanding but did not argue. Therapy had taught me that acceptance does not require agreement, it only requires clarity. We left the diner with an understanding that our relationship would be smaller but more honest. I went home feeling sad and relieved at the same time. Both emotions existed together now without tearing me apart, and that felt like progress. Out that time my finances became my main focus. Daniel helped me consolidate debt and I tracked every dollar carefully. I stopped eating out packed leftovers and skipped anything unnecessary. Friends invited me out and I declined without guilt. Every small sacrifice felt intentional instead of punishing. Watching the balances slowly shrink gave me a sense of control I had not felt in a long time. Month by month the numbers improved, and with them my confidence. I was no longer reacting to chaos, I was building stability. That distinction mattered more than the actual money. About 6 months after Lily disappeared, Megan called again. This time her voice was calm and professional. She told me Lily had been arrested in another state for stealing from an elderly couple she was living with. She had posed as a student needing housing and drained their accounts. There were similar complaints across multiple states, and prosecutors believed jail time was likely. Hearing that did not make me happy, but it did bring relief. Lily could not hurt anyone else for a while. Megan mentioned my documentation had helped establish a pattern. I thanked her and ended the call sitting quietly in my living room, processing the strange peace that followed. I shared the news with Carol, who simply said good and let the silence sit. Neither of us needed to analyze it further. Consequences had finally caught up, and that was enough. Susan learned about Lily's arrest later through extended family and reacted with shock, mixed with denial. She insisted Lily was misunderstood and troubled. I did not argue. Therapy had taught me when silence was stronger than debate. I offered sympathy without validation and changed the subject. It was the healthiest response I had ever given her, and it felt strange. But right with my finances improving, I began thinking about my future again. Not in abstract hopes, but real plans. I met with a real estate agent named Sharon who showed me modest homes within my budget. The first two were wrong for different reasons, but the third felt quietly right. Small, outdated, but solid. I made an offer, and to my surprise, it was accepted quickly. Signing those papers weeks later felt surreal. Walking out knowing I owned something that no one else could claim was a moment I will never forget. It was not just a house, it was proof that I could rebuild after losing so much. Moving in was simple and imperfect. Friends helped carry boxes and Carol showed up with curtains. Mark installed lights and David fixed a loose cabinet. Susan arrived unexpectedly holding a casserole and wandered through the rooms with an unreadable expression. She commented on the size, and I chose not to respond. Later she told a story about my father that made me laugh, and for a brief moment things felt normal. Not healed but human. I held on to that moment without expecting it to last. Life settled into a quieter rhythm after that. Susan and I spoke occasionally, and the conversations stayed contained. Lily remained blocked everywhere, and I felt no urge to check on her. My world grew smaller but safer, and that safety allowed me to breathe again. Therapy continued, and Laura helped me separate responsibility from compassion. She reminded me that boundaries were not punishment but protection. That lesson echoed through every part of my life and improved relationships I had not realized were 10 months after everything began, I sat in my living room on a calm Saturday morning with coffee and sunlight filtering through the windows. My bank account was no longer bleeding and my mind felt clear. Susan was managing her life with limited help and shared responsibility. The chaos that once defined my days had faded into something manageable. The cost of that lesson had been enormous financially and emotionally, but the result was a life built on intention instead of guilt. As I planned small changes to my home and my future, I understood something deeply for the first time. Loving someone does not mean sacrificing yourself, and choosing peace is not selfish, it is survival. As the months passed, the quiet of my new home became something I relied on. Not the empty kind that echoes with loneliness, but the steady calm that lets you hear your own thoughts clearly. Mornings started with coffee and sunlight instead of anxiety and missed calls. I checked my finances weekly and watched the numbers slowly improve. Every payment made felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been taken without consent. Susan and I kept our distance but remained loosely connected through brief phone calls and occasional texts. She still complained about money and her health, but the urgency was gone. Without a constant audience, her crises lost their dramatic edge, and that told me more than any apology ever could. Therapy continued to open doors I did not know existed. Laura helped me unpack memories from childhood that suddenly looked different through adult eyes. Working long hours as a teenager to pay for my own needs, while Susan framed it as independence training. Being praised for being responsible while quietly absorbing the message that my value came from what I provided. These patterns explained why saying no felt like betrayal, even when yes was destroying me. Understanding that did not erase the past, but it gave me power over the present. I practiced setting boundaries in small ways with friends and coworkers, and noticed how relationships actually improved when I stopped overextending myself. Susan struggled with the new reality more than she admitted. Carol and Mark told me she complained privately about feeling controlled and judged. Hearing that stung, but it no longer sent me into panic mode. I reminded myself that discomfort was not harm and that her feelings were not mine to fix. When Susan tried to bypass the agreement by asking Carol for money, Carol held firm and redirected her to budgeting resources. Knowing my family was unified brought a sense of safety I had never experienced before. We were no longer isolated targets, but a connected front. One afternoon, Susan showed up at my door without calling, holding paperwork and looking flustered. My heart raced for a moment out of old habit, but I took a breath before opening the door. She needed help understanding a medical bill and asked if I could explain it. I invited her in, and we sat at the kitchen table. I walked her through the charges and insurance adjustments without offering to pay. She watched me carefully, as if waiting for the old pattern to resume. When it did not, she sighed and thanked me quietly. That small moment felt like proof that support did not have to equal sacrifice. Not everything moved forward smoothly. There were setbacks and moments when guilt crept back in unexpectedly. Once Susan mentioned how lonely she felt during the holidays, and my instinct was to fill that space immediately. Instead, I acknowledged her feelings and suggested she reach out to a community group Carol had found for her. She sounded disappointed but agreed to try. Later, Carol told me Susan attended a few meetings and even made a friend. Hearing that filled me with cautious hope. Not because I believed she would change completely, but because it showed she could adapt when forced tutoring. This time, I focused on making my house truly feel like mine. I painted rooms in colors I loved and arranged furniture without worrying about anyone else's opinion. Each choice reinforced the idea that my life belonged to me. Friends visited and commented on how peaceful the space felt, and I realized that peace was something I had earned through hard decisions and painful honesty. It was not accidental, and it was not fragile anymore. It was built on boundaries that held firm even when tested. Work became easier once my personal life stabilized. I found myself more focused and confident, and my performance reviews reflected that change. My boss mentioned potential advancement, and for the first time I allowed myself to imagine long-term goals without fear of being derailed by someone else's crisis. Planning felt safe again, and that alone felt like a victory. I no longer lived waiting for the next emergency call. Susan and I met occasionally for coffee, always in public, and always with clear start and end times. Our conversations stayed surface level but respectful. She still avoided taking responsibility fully and sometimes hinted that Lily had influenced her more than she admitted. I listened without arguing and changed the subject when it became circular. Laura reminded me that acceptance did not mean agreement and that repeating the same argument would only reopen wounds. I practiced letting things be unresolved and discovered that the world did not collapse when I did. Late one evening, Carol called to check in and mentioned that Susan had finally started regular financial counseling, as required by the agreement. She was resistant at first but began to understand how deeply she had mismanaged money for years. Hearing that felt validating, not because I wanted Susan to suffer but because I wanted acknowledgement that the chaos had not been imagined or exaggerated. It had been real and damaging, and it required real change. Knowing professionals were now involved gave me peace of mind I did not realize I needed around this time. I received notice that one of the fraudulent debts had been fully resolved and removed from my credit report. Seeing that confirmation brought unexpected emotion. It felt like closing a chapter that had haunted me silently. I printed the notice and placed it in my documents folder alongside the contract and investigator reports. Not because I wanted to dwell on the past, but because I wanted a record of what I survived. Evidence that my boundaries had teeth and that standing up for myself produced tangible results. Susan continued to test limits in subtle ways, once asking if I could co-sign a loan, and another time hinting that she might move closer to me if she could afford it. I declined calmly and without explanation. The absence of drama surprised both of us. She grew quieter after that, and our interactions became more predictable. Predictability was something I valued now more than emotional intensity. It meant safety and clarity. As the first anniversary of Lily leaving approached, I reflected on how much had changed. My life no longer revolved around managing other people's emotions or finances. I slept better, laughed more, and trusted myself again. The cost of learning these lessons had been enormous, but the return was stability and self-respect. I knew there would always be a complicated history with Susan and that some wounds would never fully close. But I also knew I could live with that without losing myself. One evening, Susan called to say she had been cleaning and found old photo albums. She talked about memories from my childhood and moments with my father. Her voice softened in a way I had not heard in years. I listened and shared a few memories of my own. For a short while we connected without manipulation or expectation. When the call ended, I felt sadness and acceptance coexist peacefully. The relationship we had would never be simple, but it no longer controlled my life. I ended that day sitting on my couch looking around the home I had built and the routines I had created. Everything felt intentional now, from my finances to my relationships. I understood that choosing myself did not mean abandoning family, it meant redefining how love worked in my life. Boundaries had given me freedom rather than distance, and that realization grounded me as I moved forward. Whatever came next, I knew I could face it without sacrificing my stability again. The final stretch of that year arrived quietly without announcements or dramatic moments. It felt like standing on solid ground after months of moving water. My routines became steady and predictable, and that predictability was something I once would have found boring but now felt like safety. Mornings started the same way with coffee and planning instead of anxiety and damage control. Evenings ended with calm instead of exhaustion. I noticed how my body felt different without constant stress. My shoulders relaxed, my sleep deepened, and my thoughts stopped racing. Peace did not arrive all at once, but it stayed once it settled. Susan continued living her life within the limits we had set, and while she did not transform into a different person, she adapted enough to function. She attended counseling irregularly, but consistently enough to keep momentum. Carol and Mark kept their rotation, and David checked in occasionally. No one carried the entire burden anymore, and that balance mattered. Susan still complained and still avoided full accountability, but the manipulation lost its power without access to my finances or guilt. I learned that distance could exist alongside compassion, and that lesson reshaped how I viewed family entirely. One afternoon, Susan asked if she could visit, and I agreed with clear boundaries. She arrived carrying a small plant and an envelope and stood awkwardly on my porch. Inside the envelope was a simple card with a short message written in her familiar handwriting. It said she was sorry for not seeing me. There were no excuses, no explanations, no references to Lily or hardship, just that sentence. It did not undo the past or repair the damage, but it mattered because it was the first apology that did not ask for anything in return. I thanked her and invited her in for coffee. We talked about ordinary things, and when she left I placed the plant by the window and felt a quiet sense of closure settle. N-Team continued moving forward without pulling me backward. My finances improved steadily, and watching my savings grow felt like proof that I could recover from even deep losses. Each payment made reduced more than debt, it reduced fear. I stopped checking my accounts obsessively and trusted my systems. Work continued to go well, and opportunities opened that I would not have had the focus or energy to pursue before. I realized how much emotional labor had been draining my professional life and how clarity allowed me to show up fully again. News about Lily stayed distant and factual. Megan confirmed legal proceedings were ongoing and that Lily faced serious consequences. I did not follow details or seek updates beyond what was necessary. Her story no longer intersected with mine, and that separation felt intentional and healthy. Knowing she could not reach me, or anyone in my family anymore, brought relief, not satisfaction. Accountability existed, and that was enough. I released the need to understand her motivations or feel closure beyond safety. Therapy sessions with Laura shifted focus from crisis recovery to long-term growth. We talked about identity beyond survival and how to build a life guided by values instead of reactions. She helped me see how resilience did not mean enduring harm but choosing environments that allowed growth. I practiced trusting my instincts again and honoring discomfort as information rather than something to suppress. Each insight strengthened my confidence and reshaped how I approached relationships, both old and new. Susan and I found a rhythm that worked for both of us. Occasional lunches, brief calls, shared updates without emotional weight. She still struggled with envy and regret, but she stopped projecting those feelings onto me as often. When she did, I named it calmly and changed the subject. She learned that pushing would not yield results, and I learned that calm firmness was more effective than explanations. Our relationship remained imperfect but functional, and that was a realistic outcome I could accept. As the seasons changed, I reflected on how much my perspective had shifted. I no longer measured love by sacrifice or loyalty by endurance. I understood that care could exist without self-destruction, and that boundaries did not erase connection, they refined it. My friendships deepened as I became more present and less resentful. My social life improved because I was no longer depleted by family chaos. I laughed more easily and felt lighter without carrying obligations that were never mine to begin with. One quiet weekend morning, I sat in my living room with sunlight filling the space and thought about the person I had been before all of this began. Someone eager to help, fearful of conflict, and conditioned to equate worth with usefulness. I did not judge that version of myself harshly because she did the best she could with what she knew. But I also recognized how far I had come. Growth did not require erasing the past, it required learning from it and choosing differently moving forwards. Called later that day to share a memory about my father, and for once the story did not feel heavy or manipulative. It felt like shared nostalgia without expectation. I listened and contributed, and when the call ended, I did not feel drained. That neutrality was something I once thought impossible. It showed me that relationships could evolve without dramatic reconciliation or complete separation. Sometimes survival meant redefining connection rather than severing it entirely. As the year closed, I reviewed my goals and adjusted them with intention. Financial stability, personal peace, and emotional honesty sat at the center of everything. I stopped chasing approval and started prioritizing alignment. Decisions became easier when filtered through self-respect. I no longer feared being labeled selfish because I understood the difference between selfishness and self-preservation. That clarity shaped every choice I made afterward. Looking back, the cost of that year was immense, financially, emotionally, and psychologically. But the lessons gained reshaped my entire life. I learned how easily love can be weaponized through guilt, and how critical it is to protect oneself even when pressure comes from family. I learned that saying no can be an act of care rather than cruelty, and that boundaries are expressions of truth rather than punishment. Today, my life is quieter and smaller in some ways, but infinitely stronger. I live in a home I earned with peace I built and systems that protect me. Susan remains part of my life within limits, and that balance allows space for compassion without sacrifice. Lily exists only as a chapter that ended and will not be reopened. My future feels stable because it is grounded in choice rather than obligation. I finish each day knowing that I am no longer funding other people's chaos or carrying guilt that does not belong to me. My story did not end with revenge or dramatic confrontation. It ended with clarity and self-respect. That outcome feels more powerful than any argument ever could. I choose peace, I choose boundaries, and I choose myself. And for the first time, that choice feels natural rather than forced.